I can't stand anything about you. We're going to live as just our own family, so get out.
These words came out of nowhere from my daughter-in-law, Sarah, and I was left speechless. I couldn't believe I was being told the same thing again. I'd already left my parents' home alone after being told something similar. There they were, trying to kick me out of this house too. Anger bubbled up inside me.
Fine, I'll leave,
I declared, grabbed my belongings, and left the house. I'd had enough. I swore to myself that I would never forgive Sarah. I began putting my plan into action. As a result, Sarah became. My name is Rebecca Mills, and I'm 61 years old this year. Technically, I've retired, but I'm fortunate to still work even after leaving my full-time job. That said, I'm not going into the office every day. I just pop in occasionally for meetings, most of which are remote, so I'm essentially working from home. My son and his wife seemed to think I was no longer working at all. I lost my husband in my 40s. After that, I lived with my oldest son Chris and his wife Sarah. Our home was an old, large property, full of quirks and problems, but I was attached to it. That was part of why I hadn't moved. Financially, I never had to worry. Most of my husband's life insurance remained untouched, so I didn't have any concerns about my retirement. Still, even with this comfortable lifestyle, I had my worries. They all revolved around Sarah. Sarah was strong-willed, and we clashed often. This wasn't new, but it started from the moment she came to introduce herself after she and Chris got engaged. I'll never forget the outfit she showed up in. She wore a casual shirt and pants with some stains on them. She said,
I wanted to show you my authentic self.
But honestly, it was completely inappropriate. Maybe I was being harsh, but she always seemed to have some excuse or justification for everything. She was sharp-tongued, which made her even harder to deal with. I never understood why Chris had chosen her as his wife. Later, I learned that Sarah was the one who pursued him. She was undeniably beautiful, and Chris, a bit naive and inexperienced, fell for her hard. Even after they got engaged, it was always the same story. Sarah had this way of acting casual, which could be charming, but it often crossed into just being plain inconsiderate. I wanted to oppose their marriage, but I told myself it was what Chris wanted, so I held my tongue. Then, they got married. Chris insisted we live together after the wedding, saying he didn't want to leave me alone in my big house. I thought for sure Sarah would oppose the idea, but to my surprise, she agreed. It didn't take long for me to understand why. From the moment we started living together, Sarah dumped all the household responsibilities on me. Cleaning, laundry, cooking, she left it all to me. She was a stay-at-home wife, though. She quit her job as soon as they got married. Even though I didn't need to go into the office every day, my remote work meant I had less free time. Whenever I was working on my computer, Sarah would make snide comments like,
All you ever do is play around.
At first, I found it easier to laugh and brush it off rather than argue back. But when it kept happening, I eventually hit my limit.
Sarah, since it seems like you've got plenty of free time, could you take care of the cleaning for me?
I once asked her this while she was absent-mindedly watching daytime soap operas. She gave me a look of utter disdain. Then, with a dramatic sigh, she said,
I don't do housework for your sake. Don't you get it? It's sad that you can't understand my thoughtfulness.
Using her unique logic, she proceeded to blame me. According to Sarah, if she took on the housework, she'd be taking away my only job. If I stopped being active, I'd become unhealthy. Not only that, but a lack of stimulation could lead to dementia. In other words, Sarah was supposedly letting me do the housework. out of the goodness of her heart. Her twisted reasoning made my head spin.
We moved in together to keep an eye on you so you wouldn't slack off.
She said this with a half smile, leaving me too stunned to respond. I regretted our decision to live together. If we'd stayed apart, I wouldn't have to see the things I didn't want to see. Every day, I regretted the choice. Doing housework under Sarah's constant watch felt like torture. I finally hit my breaking point and decided to talk to Chris. It wasn't to complain about Sarah. Instead, I told him I wanted to move out and live alone in an apartment. The house we were living in was old, with lots of steps and uneven floors. It had aged in many ways, and after injuring my leg last year, it had become increasingly difficult to live there. I explained to him how challenging it was to stay in the house, and I moved into an apartment. It might have seemed like Sarah had driven me out, but I didn't regret leaving. The new apartment was a rental. It was a bit large for one person, but I chose a size that would accommodate my grandkids if they ever wanted to stay over. I even customized the interior to suit my taste, making it my own little sanctuary. However, my happiness was short-lived. Sarah started coming over every day and staying until late at night.
This new apartment is so nice. Don't you think it's too big for you, Rebecca?
She said this while lounging on the living room sofa.
By the way, Rebecca, you should come back to the house during the day to do the housework. It's for your health and longevity, after all.
To my surprise, she suggested that I do their housework. Sarah's selfishness was overwhelming.
I've already moved out, Sarah. As the wife, it's your responsibility to handle things. Besides, I'm managing the housework here just fine, and my annual health checkups have been great. There's nothing for you to worry about.
Sarah turned her head away, ignoring my response. She always pretended not to hear anything inconvenient for her. It was her go-to tactic. Even after that, she kept showing up at my apartment every day. The other day, she even said,
It's too much trouble to go home.
And stayed the night. My apartment and the house were only about a 15-minute walk apart. Chris had insisted I choose a place close to the house, saying he'd worry if I wasn't nearby in case something happened. Therefore, I felt a twinge of guilt about leaving the house. One day, after being out for work during the afternoon, I came home in the evening and was shocked. Sarah had let herself into my apartment. She apparently used the spare key I'd secretly given Chris for emergencies.
Hi, Rebecca.
She said, lying on the floor in front of the TV without even getting up.
Sarah, the spare key is for emergencies. It doesn't mean you can let yourself in when I'm not here.
It was deeply unpleasant to have someone entering my home without permission while I wasn't there. For the first time, I firmly confronted Sarah. Normally, I'd give up arguing halfway, but this time I stood my ground, and it seemed to have struck a nerve. Sarah glared at me with an irritated expression. I glared back.
You're so stingy. That's exactly why I can't stand you.
She snapped, launching into a rant.
I can't stand anything about you. As for this apartment, only my family will live here, so get out.
Yelling, she tried to push me out the front door. Clearly, she couldn't stand the fact that I was living in this apartment. She complained that it wasn't fair because I lived in a new, comfortable place while they had to stay in the old house.
This rent is being paid by Chris anyway, right? So it makes sense for us to live here. You're living beyond your means.
Apparently, Sarah believed Chris was covering the rent. It made sense then why she'd been so persistent about coming over. In her mind, this apartment was supposed to belong to their family.
Fine. I'll leave.
I said this while glaring right back at her. I felt it was time to teach her a lesson. We agreed I'd move out within 3 days. Still suspicious, Sarah demanded I call my acquaintances to help me moving out in front of her. So I pulled out my phone and scheduled them for 2 days later. Satisfied, Sarah left with a smug look on her face. As I watched her go, I began to form a plan. As promised, I moved out. My new place was an apartment complex for seniors, where I'd arranged to stay for a trial period of 2 weeks. I handed Sarah the apartment key and the lease agreement. I also worked with the landlord, who I'd known for years, to transfer the lease into Sarah's name. Chris was furious when he found out Sarah had forced me out. He even started talking about divorce. Though Sarah didn't seem to care. She even said,
"Then let's live separately."
and moved into the apartment by herself and began living there. I was stunned at how shameless she could be. 5 days later, Sarah finally learned the truth. While I was working remotely one morning, my phone started buzzing repeatedly with calls from Sarah. Expecting this, I had already prepared a voice recorder. I hit record and picked up the call.
"Hey, Rebecca, what's the deal with this rent? Why do I have to pay it? This is ridiculous."
As soon as I picked up the phone, Sarah shouted. Her panic was evident in her rapid, frantic tone.
Oh. Isn't your name now on the lease? It's only fair you pay the rent. Is there a problem?
I deliberately kept my voice calm and slow, which only seemed to make Sarah more flustered.
"Well, Chris was paying it before, wasn't he? He should keep paying it. We're not even divorced yet."
She admitted that she'd already contacted Chris about the rent, but he told her to ask me since I knew the truth. The truth was that Chris had never paid a cent of this rent. In fact, I had been financially supporting him instead. Even after retiring, I stayed on as a consultant for my company. I also took on freelance advisory work, earning a decent income thanks to my experience. In reality, I was earning far more than Chris ever did. Because of Sarah's tendency to overspend, Chris was struggling and I secretly provided financial support to help him out.
That's why this is all a misunderstanding on your part, Sarah. I've been paying the rent for that place from the start. Chris hasn't put in a single cent.
Sarah, who had been planning to enjoy her separate life in the new apartment, seemed shocked that her expectations had been completely wrong. After venting everything she wanted to say, she abruptly hung up the call. I immediately contacted Chris. I played back the recorded conversation for him.
I've been holding back for so long, but I'm at my limit. Don't you feel the same way?
I knew Chris was exhausted from repaying the debts Sarah had accumulated. No matter how grown-up Chris is, I can't just stand by as a parent. Some might call it being soft, but I believe it's only natural as a parent. He sighed and said quietly,
"I'm going to get a divorce. I'm just too tired."
All right, then follow my plan.
I replied. I explained the steps to him and gave him instructions. First, I asked him to take a few days off from work, starting today. Then, I told him to secretly move his important belongings out of the house without letting Sarah know. A big moving truck might tip Sarah off, especially since she was staying in an apartment nearby, so I suggested moving things out little by little at night. The new address was somewhere Sarah didn't know. It was a single-family home I had picked out as my final residence. Thus, the plan quietly began to unfold. 3 days later, Sarah called me again. She sounded even more frantic than before.
What's got you so worked up?
I asked, speaking in the same deliberately calm tone as before. Sarah was almost panicking.
"Rebecca, the house has been listed for sale. and my parents told me my stuff got delivered to their place. What's going on?
It seemed Chris had followed my instructions perfectly. He sent Sarah's belongings to her parents' house and emptied out the home they had been living in. That house was then up for sale.
The landlord said if I can't pay the rent, I'll have to move out. When I tried to talk to Chris and went back to the house, I found the gate locked with chains and a for sale sign out front. What am I supposed to do?
She sounded hysterical. I can imagine how shocked she must have been to return home and find it in that state. However, the sale was already finalized and the house was out of our hands as well.
Sarah, there's a lot that needs to be clarified.
I said, finally addressing the situation head-on. This was my chance to unload all the stress I had been carrying.
First of all, I'm no longer your mother-in-law, right? Chris had already filed the divorce papers. You signed them yourself, didn't you? Now you and I are strangers.
Chris had already submitted the divorce papers. Apparently, Sarah had signed them a long time ago. Threatening divorce was one of her favorite tactics whenever things didn't go her way. Chris had hoped she might change and had let it slide because she was someone he had once loved enough to marry. He felt he had no choice but to give in whenever she used divorce as a threat. However, he finally woke up. He signed the papers she had long used as leverage and submitted them, making the divorce official.
You always said you'd get a divorce if Chris didn't do what you wanted. Looks like things went just the way you wanted, didn't they, Sarah?
I could hear her gasp on the other end of the line. She wanted to argue but seemed at a loss for words.
You know, I'm concerned about you. How are you going to manage staying in that apartment after the divorce? You don't have a job, and moving costs money. That sounds tough.
How could you possibly afford to pay that kind of money? This is unbelievable.
Sarah completely lost her temper, yelling and hurling insults at me for what felt like forever. She even started saying she married Chris only because of the inheritance left by my late husband. Though, the truth is, I had been managing the entire inheritance, and she hadn't been able to access a single penny. She kept ranting about how her plan to pay off her debts through the marriage had fallen apart. Of course, I recorded the entire conversation and played it back for Chris. I planned to use it as evidence if the divorce ended up going to mediation. Knowing this would probably be the last time, I sat silently and let her scream until she ran out of steam. She went on for at least 15 minutes, easily.
I'm sorry. I've been disowned by my parents, and now I have nowhere to go. Please help me.
She finally said, breaking down in tears and begging for my help. Apparently, her compulsive spending and debt problems had caused her to bring so much trouble to her parents that they had disowned her. It all made sense. I remember sensing a strange distance from her family even during the wedding. It turned out that feeling was spot on. With no place to go and no one to turn to, Sarah's situation seemed pitiful. For a moment, I felt sorry for her. However, I quickly reminded myself that she had brought this upon herself.
It's too late for apologies now. We're no longer family, so there's nothing left to talk about. Good luck with your life from here on out.
I said before ending the call. Honestly, I felt a huge sense of relief. After our call, Sarah apparently stormed into Chris's workplace and caused a major scene. It got so bad that they had to call the police, as Chris informed me when he got home from work that day. She continued squatting in her apartment without paying rent, but the landlord eventually changed the locks while she was out. Since then, she couldn't even get back into the place. I imagine she must have tried calling both Chris and me, but we had already canceled our phones and switched to new ones with different numbers. No matter how much she tried, she couldn't reach us. We also didn't give her the address of our new house, so there was no way for her to find us. After the incident at Chris's workplace, a restraining order was issued against her. With nowhere else to go, Sarah eventually headed to her parents' home, despite being disowned. When she got there, she was met with a shocking sight. Her belongings, which I had shipped to her parents' house, were left out in the backyard, exposed to the rain and elements. She wasn't even allowed to step inside. The unpaid rent from her apartment had also been forwarded to her parents, making them even angrier. From what I've heard, since then, Sarah lived in an apartment provided by an organization that helps people without housing. Without the ability to spend extravagantly as she used to, the stress seemed to have taken a toll on her. When I happened to pass her on the street one day, I barely recognized her. Her hair had turned almost completely gray, her skin was dry and rough, and she looked nothing like the woman I once knew. It's amazing how much people can change when their circumstances shift. As for me, I've started a new chapter of my life in the house I bought with my late husband's inheritance. It's a two-family home so that Chris will have space when he eventually remarries. For now, he joins me for dinner most nights, but he's become much more independent in other aspects of his life. I've come to realize this balance is just the right amount of closeness for us. The proceeds from selling our old home have been set aside for the future. When Chris finds someone new, I plan to use that money to support him and his new wife. Of course, it'll be there for the grandchildren I hope to have someday. In the meantime, I've started working on creating a garden at my new house, something I've always dreamed of having. On my days off, I spend time tending to the young trees and herbs in the garden. This new life feels full of hope and possibility.